I was travelling on the train to London. Beside me there sat a man in his late 50s, and he was reading what was obviously a scientific article. So as the train jogged along, being an Irishman and not an Englishman, I said, "I see you're a scientist." He said, "That's right, I'm a metallurgist." "What are you?" I said, "I'm a mathematician." And we descended into silence. I then took out the New Testament and started to read it. And I could see after a few moments he was glancing over to see what book I was reading. So I made it easy for him to see what it was. And after a moment or two he said, "Excuse me, you're reading the New Testament?" I said, "That's right." And I went on reading. And after 3 minutes he said, "I don't really want to disturb you," but he said, "You did say you're a mathematician and you're reading the New Testament. How is that possible?" I said, "Tell me, have you got any hope?" And he went white. And he started to shake. And then after a moment or two he said, "I guess we'll all muddle through." I said, "You know that's not what my question was. Have you got any personal hope?" And he said, "None whatsoever." "And you asked me," I said, "why I'm reading the New Testament." He said, "I've never read it." So I gave him one. And as I gave it to him, a woman's head loomed up behind the seat, and she had hair going away up like this. And she said, "I couldn't help overhearing you. I believe in Mother Earth, you know." So I could see where she was coming from. And she said, "Could I have one of those little books too?" And so I gave her one. Because I actually believe that Scripture is the Word of God. So my wife makes sure that I'm carrying at least 2 Gideon Testaments wherever I go. Have you any hope? And questions like that are coming up every day. The big questions of life. Why am I? Why is this universe here? Why indeed is there something rather than nothing? What is ultimate reality? Is this universe all that exists and therefore explains itself? Or is there something more? What is a human being? Is a human being, as John Gray, the professor of European thought at London says, of no more significance than slime mold, a particularly lowly form of bacteria? Or are human beings special in any sense? Have I a purpose? Have I a future? Have I any meaning? Is there any hope? And from ancient times there have been essentially 2 answers to these basic questions. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle thought that the universe did not explain itself. It wasn't ultimate reality. There was something more, something transcendent. And indeed, long before those Greek philosophers, the ancient Hebrews had taught that the universe was not all that existed. There was a God who had created it and continued to sustain it. Against that, there were Greeks who taught that all there were atoms and the void. The brilliant atomist who invented the theory of atoms, Democritus, said atoms and the void are all that exist, and the atoms come pouring through the void, and eventually they form stars, and they form the earth, and ultimately they form human life. Everything that exists is the result of mindless, unguided processes. That is the view that we call materialism. And those 2 ancient views are dominant in our culture today. And debate between them has reached a new intensity with the advent of the new atheism, led by Richard Dawkins, the professor of the public understanding of science at Oxford. And a group of intellectuals calling themselves the 4 Horsemen are determined to mount an all-out attack on the existence of God. The new atheism differs from the old atheism, not in its argument so much as its militancy. Richard Dawkins, at a recent conference in the United States, said, "I am not recommending atheism to you. I am recommending militant atheism." And the new atheists stand with the ancient atomists. The ultimate reality is matter and energy. And just as our solar system will eventually be engulfed by the death throes of our sun, so every human being will be individually engulfed much sooner by the forces of nature, and your life will prove ultimately to have no significance whatsoever. Against that background, with its increasing intensity, I wish to present the biblical view, a view that to me is more credible than atheism, since it makes far more sense of reality, since it is supported by powerful evidence, both objective and subjective. And so we tonight shall start where the Bible starts, with those magnificent words, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female, he created them." And then the New Testament comment on that by John at the beginning of his gospel. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made." In the beginning, God. When I was married many years ago, last century, I stood with Sally and listened to a talk that neither of us will ever forget. The famous evangelist Stan Ford said, "In the beginning, God." You're starting a new life today, together, a new beginning. In the beginning, God. I never forgot it. I did not realize then how prophetic his words would be of the kind of areas into which life would take me. But those words, if we can grasp them, are so profound for every one of you. And I trust that this week, that some of you are going to make a new beginning. I don't know what journey it's the beginning of, but I do know that it will only be meaningful if in the beginning God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The universe is not the ultimate reality. It was created. God is the ultimate reality. The existence of God is assumed and not explained. This is a fatal weakness, says Richard Dawkins. If you say that God made the universe, then we shall have to ask who made God. This, to my great astonishment, is one of the main arguments of his million-selling book, The God Delusion. So let's think about it, because it disturbs many people. If you say God made the universe, then who made God? Well, logic will tell you that you can only ask the question, who made God, if you are thinking of a made God. Elementary logic shows that, doesn't it? That is a created God. So Dawkins is thinking of created gods. Well, created gods, ladies and gentlemen, certainly are a delusion, and very few people need Richard Dawkins' help to see that. In particular, Christians have always believed that created gods are a delusion. We usually call them idols. If Dawkins had entitled his book The Created Gods Delusion, it could have been reduced in size very considerably, but then sales might just have suffered. The biblical claim is that God is eternal. He is uncreated. He did not come to exist. We see that very clearly in John's account of creation. Because if you translate it a little bit more literally, it goes like this. In the beginning the Word was, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him. And without him, nothing came to be that came to be. The Word already was. That is, God, the Word, never came to be. The universe did come to be. It did not always exist. It belongs to the category of the made. Now, this is the biblical claim. Dawkins repudiates it, but I would like to know what his difficulty is. What does he believe about the universe? If he believes it is eternal, then he believes in something eternal, and so he cannot logically object to us believing in an eternal God, unless, of course, his real problem is not with the eternal at all in terms of an eternal thing. His problem is with the existence of an eternal person. On the other hand, Richard Dawkins certainly appears to believe that the universe created him, so that we are perfectly justified in turning his own question back at himself. If you say the universe created you, we shall have to ask you, who created the universe? It is, you see, no weakness that the Bible starts by asserting the existence of God. World-class philosopher Alvin Plantinga says explanations come to an end. For theism, they come to an end in God. Of course, the same goes for any other view. On any view, explanations come to an end. The materialist, for example, doesn't have an explanation for the existence of elementary particles. They just are. God is eternal. He did not come to be. The universe is not eternal. It did come to be. And everything that begins to exist had a cause. God did not begin to exist. He did not have a cause. We need to get this very clearly in focus, since there have been people who believe that the gods themselves came to be. The Greek poet Hesiod, 700 BC, in his poem Theogony, a word that means the genealogy of the gods, speaks of the race of venerable gods who rose from the beginning, whom the spacious heaven and earth produced. And long before him, one of the most famous creation stories from the ancient world arose. It is the Babylonian epic Enuma Elish, so called since its first words in the original language are Enuma Elish, which means when on high. It is in part a cosmogony. It relates the origin of the cosmos. It talks about the formation of the world, where a goddess was cut in two, and the heavens were made of one half, and the earth made of another half. But the fascinating thing about that document is this. It speaks not only about the origin of the universe, it speaks about the origin of the gods, how they arose from the primeval chaos, indeed from a primeval soup. There's nothing new in that idea. So the Babylonian gods then were material gods. They evolved from the original stuff of the universe. And you say, how's that relevant to us? Very relevant. Because there are leading physicists today who look at our universe and see its complexity and see how finely balanced its fundamental constants are. And they say there must be an intelligence behind all of this. And then they say it's a superhuman intelligence, but it's not a supernatural intelligence. It's a superhuman intelligence, but it must have evolved like everything else, because there's no other way for complexity to arise than through a mindless, unguided process from the basic stuff of the universe. And these modern thinkers are scarcely a hair's breadth away in their thinking from the ancient Babylonians. And ladies and gentlemen, that's why we're going to study the book of Daniel this week. For that book of the Old Testament, written 26 centuries ago, is as contemporary as it could be, because it tells us how 4 young men who were brought up to believe in one true God, the creator of heaven and earth, how they maintained that faith when they were suddenly catapulted as teenagers into a polytheistic, highly advanced culture of Babylon. And the story tells how they maintained their faith in spite of the powerful opposition of the thinking that surrounded them. But not only maintained their faith. I meet many people who maintain their faith. And you'll see them privately engaged in their devotions and going to church. But the thing that they've long since stopped is maintaining their witness. They've lost the cutting edge of their sharpness. They don't engage in society. Why is that? A lot of it has to do with fear. Do you get afraid? I do. This world is a daunting place. And the moment you put your head above the parapet to witness to God, you find yourself, whether you like it or not, facing questions. And so the pressure is on to privatize your faith. Daniel had never seen the like of Babylon. It was brilliant at every level. Their science, their mathematics, their engineering, their astronomy, their medicine, their art, their architecture, their libraries, their learning, their music were light years ahead of anything he'd ever experienced in his home country. How could such a civilization exist and the basic philosophy on which it was based be wrong? And that's what it's like for many people today, especially people at university and college. We're surrounded by the most impressive and meteoric advances in science and technology, undreamed of a few years ago, and all of us benefit from them. And then the scientists increasingly tell us that the only intellectually respectable worldview for a scientifically literate person is atheism. Grow up, they tell us. Wake up from the dream of religion. Because all religion does is to cause trouble. And so Nobel Prize winner Steven Weinberg, a physicist, announces just recently that perhaps the best thing science can do for this generation is to eliminate religion completely. That creates a lot of pressure, you know. And if you don't feel it, because you're older and you've been brought up in a country that's been heavily Christianized, be sympathetic with the younger ones who feel that pressure. Because the Christian veneer will soon be swept away. And there's an urgency about this. Because once a person's faith in God is undermined, their fundamental stabilities begin to erode. There's such a pressure to keep quiet. And keep your faith for the private sphere. You want to believe in Christ, fine, but do it privately. Don't bring it into the public square. Do we bring it into the public square? Science is the public thing. And some scientists more generous than others, like the late Stephen Jay Gould, say that religion is all right so long as we keep it separate from science. That sounds great until we look at the small print. And the small print says this: science deals with reality, and religion deals with everything else. Fantasy, like God, Santa Claus, and the Tooth Fairy. That won't do, will it? The pressure to be silent is increasing, but Daniel and his friends withstood it then. We are called upon to withstand it now. And my objective during the mornings of this week is to lead us to think about the things that provided the firm foundation in Daniel's life as a teenager and beyond, that helped him to stand and make one of the most magnificent witnesses to faith in God that the world has ever seen. Daniel understood the basic doctrines of the nature of God and creation as taught in Genesis. So let's get back to it, to the beginning, that is, because there was a beginning. Space-time has not existed forever. And in my debate with Richard Dawkins, I pointed out that the Bible had been teaching that there was a beginning centuries before scientists came round to the same view. In the 1960s, in fact. Dawkins was not impressed. Either there was a beginning or there was not, he said, so the Bible had a 50% chance of getting it right. But it's not a question of guesswork, is it? It's a question of evidence. And the interesting thing is, when in the 1960s the evidence began to emerge that space-time had a beginning, it was strongly resisted by some of the most prominent scientists in the country. Why? Because they said it was in danger of confirming the Bible. What a wonderfully open-minded scientific attitude that was. Resisting a major scientific advance because it was seen to confirm the Bible. Well, I suppose it makes a change from saying that science disconfirms the Bible. Now, of course, the Bible is not a textbook of science in that sense. So there's a certain amount of truth in what Stephen Jay Gould says. Science tends to deal with the how questions. How does it work? It doesn't deal with the questions of purpose or meaning as does the Bible. So I do not teach algebra in Oxford from Genesis. However, there are certain passages in Scripture like Genesis that do talk about the universe, and so have very big implications for our understanding it at all levels. God created the heavens and the earth. They are therefore not God. God is distinct from the universe. Nature isn't divine. The Bible is not pantheist. Indeed, according to Genesis, the sun, moon, and stars are simply light bearers. They are not gods. Secondly, God, the eternal God, the Creator who was there at the beginning, is personal. Look at the verbs in Genesis 1. God said, "Let there be light." God called. God saw that it was good. God blessed. All these verbs make sense only for persons. God distinct from the universe, then. God is personal. That means, of course, God is not a force, not even the force. There is a great danger of a Star Wars mentality. Forces, we're persons. And so we know ourselves instinctively to be superior to forces. We use forces. And if you go on thinking that God is a force, you think you can use him. But it should be the opposite way round. He is our creator and our God. It is for him to use us. And then we find there are steps to creation. The 6 days to human beings. And I'm sure you'd love to know what I think about those 6 days. Well, you can come to the question session then. Because I want to concentrate not on what they are, but what happened in them. The first thing we notice that is perhaps startling, God did not create everything at once. There was a sequence. And it goes up through and it ends with human beings. Of any sequence with steps, we ask, where is it going? And we see that it's going to human beings. That sequence ends and is followed by the Sabbath. And that tells us a very important thing, that creation, the creation acts of Genesis 1 are not the same as the act of God in upholding the universe and keeping it together. And then we notice that each creative step involves the Word of God. And God said, and God said, and God said. That tells me that the creation is ordered. And there are great implications of this for the doing of science. The new atheists tell me that scientists have no faith. Indeed, Christopher Hitchens has written the remarkable sentence, "Our faith is not a faith," which I don't quite understand, I must confess. Scientists have no faith. Nonsense. Every scientist believes that the universe is, at least in part, accessible by the human mind. It is rationally intelligible. Indeed, it's mathematically intelligible. Now, every scientist believes that. But how would you justify that? The Christian can justify it immediately. The reason that I, with my mind in here, can understand something of the universe out there is because the same God is responsible for both, the mind and the universe. But what does atheism tell me? Well, Richard Dawkins, in his recent book, talks about the human mind being cobbled together in such a way that you wouldn't expect it to be terribly reliable, quite so. If the thoughts in my mind are simply the random motions of atoms in my brain, as was pointed out long ago, then why should I believe any of those thoughts, including the thought that my brain is composed of atoms? As C.S. Lewis said, it's like a man sitting on the branch of a tree, cutting off the branch on which he sits. That's why I'm not ashamed of what the Bible tells me. Because it tells me that behind creation there is the Word. There is intelligibility, there is rationality, and that forms the basis of my science, so that it's no accident that the meteoric rise of science in the 16th and 17th centuries came about. Why? Why did it happen? Why is it so that Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and many others of the founding genii of science were believers in God? There's a connection. As C.S. Lewis put it, men became scientific because they expected law of nature. And they expected law of nature because they believed in a lawgiver. That's why I'm not ashamed to be a scientist and a Christian. Because history tells me that it was those basic biblical beliefs in a creator that formed the cradle out of which science has grown. It's very easy to forget our history. But there's more, isn't there? And God said. Each step begins with a word of God, an input of intelligence from outside the system. This is the exact opposite, obviously, of an unguided, mindless process, proceeding from the simple to the complex. The complexity of life is not self-generated. There is an input of energy from the outside. Nonsense, say the new atheists. You see, what you're doing now is just absurd. You're saying that God is complex and he created the universe. Well, isn't it obvious to you that giving God as an answer to anything is no answer? Why is that? Well, if you want to explain something and say, well, it's because God was there, God is more complex than the thing you're explaining. So what sort of an explanation is that? Well, God is, of course, improbably complex. But so am I. And so are you. So you don't exist, I suppose, because you're improbably complex. That is an absurd argument. Improbable beings do exist. Secondly, it is wrong to say that God is not an explanation because he's more complex than the thing you're explaining. In my college at Oxford, we have very pleasant candlelit dinners every Thursday night. And they arrange the guests in an arbitrary fashion so you never know who you'll be sitting next to. And it's usually extremely interesting, but sometimes things threaten to go wrong. Like one evening, I was introduced to the person sitting next to me, and he turned out to be a very eminent biochemist. And he asked me what I was, and I said, a pure mathematician. Oh, he said, that's awful. He said, I know nothing about mathematics, and we're going to have a really boring evening. And I said, not at all. No. I'm a pure mathematician, but I'm interested in other things. I'm interested in the really big questions of philosophy and science. He said, like what? Well, is this universe all that exists? Is there a God? And he interrupted me. He said, it's far worse than I thought. He said, listen, the bottom line is this. I'm an atheist. I'm a reductionist. And we've got nothing to talk about at all. And the look at his face showed that he meant it. So I did what I normally do when I panic. I smiled. And I said to him, you know, we're going to have a fascinating evening. He said, are we? Yes, I said, because I am intrigued by reductionism. I said, in fact, I know at least 3 kinds. I'd love to know what kind you are. So we started to talk, and I said, you know, we're scientists, both of us, so we get a big problem, we split it into little problems, we study the little problems, and we try and get insight for the big problem. That's called methodological reductionism. We do that even in our families, don't we, or solving problems at work. So we agree on that. But I think I said you're an ontological reductionist, from the word ontos, which means being. That is, that you think everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry without remainder. He says that's exactly what I believe, and that's why we've nothing to talk about. Well, I said, let's do a little experiment. So I picked up the menu on the table, and there it was in all its glory, roast chicken. So he said, what's the problem? Well, I said, you believe everything can be explained in terms of physics and chemistry? Absolutely, he said. Right, I said, let's have a go at this. Have a look at those letters, R-O-A-S-T. They carry meaning for both of us. Now I said, you're a reductionist. Yes, he said, I'm a reductionist. Everything physics and chemistry. Everything physics and chemistry. Right, I said. Explain to me the semiotics of those letters in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. Explain to me how they carry meaning. And there was a deathly silence. And his wife was sitting next to him, and she nudged him, and rather too loudly she said, get out of that if you can. But he didn't try. I was astonished at his reaction. He said, John, I've gone into my laboratory every day for the last 40 years thinking it could be done. But now I see it can't. And I was so surprised that I began to backtrack, and I said, but physics and chemistry have only been going for about 500 years seriously. Said it doesn't matter. You cannot explain the semiotics, the way those letters carry meaning, without an author, without an intelligence. It's interesting, isn't it? You see the simplest of letters traced on the sand. A letter A, 1, 2, 3 strokes. And you immediately infer that it has been written by an infinitely complex intelligence. Why is that? The strokes are simple. But you know it's semiotic. It carries meaning. Now here comes the odd thing. Let's imagine that I go into a magic laboratory in Oxford in molecular biology. And I look down a microscope that hasn't been invented yet, and you'll see in a moment why. As I look down it, I see a double helix unwinding. And I see it spitting off letters, C, G, A, A, T, C, G, A, T, G, C, E, A, G, T, C, and it goes on and on. And not knowing what this is about, I ask, what is this? Well, this is the human genome. Oh, and those letters, well, they're codons. They're the four-letter genetic alphabet that spells out the message, the word that defines a protein. How long is this genome? Oh, about 3.5 billion letters. Oh. And tell me, every letter's got to be in the right place. Well, more or less. You can't do with many alterations. Some will be fatal. It's like a computer program. Get one thing wrong and the whole thing breaks down. Yes? Well, tell me, how did that originate? Chance and necessity. Pardon? You mean chance and the laws of nature? Yes. But just half a minute. You see a letter A written in the sand and it's got 3 strokes. And you immediately say, human intelligence. And you see 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order. In the word that's written in every one of your 10 trillion cells in your body. And you say chance and necessity. Do you know, I may be very naive, but I think something odd's going on, don't you? Interesting, isn't it? There's a double think going on somewhere. In the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him. How would you know that there is a word behind this universe? I've given you one reason, haven't I? Because we can describe the universe in words brilliantly in terms of our scientific compressions, which we call mathematical formulae. That's one way of seeing it. And all of the heavens declare the glory of God. But there's another way. We've lived to an age where we've discovered that at the heart of you and at the heart of me there is a word, longer than any word that people could have hitherto conceived imaginable. And people look at it and they say chance and necessity. It's odd, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? What are you going to say about it? You see, the two views that we're going to be discussing this week are starkly represented here. You either start in the beginning with the particles, mass energy, and everything else is derivative, including the human brain and the human mind, which is the same as the brain, and the idea of God, because there isn't a God. Or you start. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him. So it's either mass energy first and everything else derivative, or it's God first and everything else derivative. And I want to say, both as a scientist and a Christian, it's obvious to me which one of those two makes sense. Oh, but there's something bigger than that, isn't there? If that begins to make sense, what are we going to make of the magnificent statement that lies at the heart of Christianity? And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That sequence in Genesis had a goal. Its goal, human beings. And we're told there that human beings are made in the image of God, uniquely so. The heavens declare the glory of God. They were not made in his image. Only you are made in the image of God. Oh, listen to what that's saying and its implications, because they're magnificent. I know the moon is there. The moon doesn't know I'm here. Same with you, isn't it? You are more important than the sun and the entire solar system. Why is that? Because the solar system and the galaxies are all there so that there'd be a home suitable for you. And when you go back to your apartment tonight or your home, you know that you're more important than that home. And that's why there are steps, so that we can gather what God is doing. He's building things up to create a home. A home for beings that are utterly unique. They're not slime mold. They're not an eczema on the face of the universe. They are human beings made in God's image. That is a magnificent message to take to the world. And I'm not ashamed of it, I tell you, because I find nothing like it in any other philosophy. It gives to me a human being value and dignity. And we live today in a society that is rapidly redefining what human beings are and what the relationship should be. And we need to come back to the profound authority of God's word. Not for nothing are we told these things, because they are meant to grip us and fire us and grab our spirits. So that instead of creeping away into our ghettos, we get out into public and start confessing the reality of God. You are made in the image of God. The Word became flesh. I got the opportunity to lecture to 500 or 600 physicists at our atomic weapons research establishment. And after I'd lectured, a very bright physicist came over and with a cheery smile, he said, "Well, Dr. Lennox, that was very interesting, but, you know, I noticed that you're a Christian." Well, I said, "You're very sharp." He said, "Now look," he said, "let's come to the point. You're a Christian. That means you're obliged to believe that Jesus is simultaneously God and human." "That's right." He said, "Can you explain it to me?" I said, "Sure." He was quite taken aback. But I said, just as a little quid pro quo, can I ask you a simpler question first as a physicist that intrigues me? He said, "Sure." I said, "What is consciousness?" And after a moment's thought, he said, "I don't know." Well, I said, "Okay, I'll go for an easier one. What is energy?" And he said, "Well, we can measure it, we can use it." And I said, "You know, that's not the question. What is it?" He said, "I don't know." Well, I said, "That's very interesting. You don't know." I said, "Do you believe in energy?" "Yeah." "Do you believe in consciousness?" "Yeah." "So you believe in two things as a physicist, you don't know what they are." I said, "Do you think I should write you off as a physicist?" And he said, "Please don't." But I said, "You were going to write me off, weren't you? You can't even explain to me the simplest things, the simplest bits of the universe. And you were going to wipe me out because I couldn't explain to you the most profound thing in all the universe, how God could become a man." And I said, "But you did say you believed in them. Why do you believe in them?" Well, he wasn't so sure, so I said, "Let me tell you why you believe in them. Consciousness and energy, that is." I said, "You believe in them not because you know what they are, but because they make sense of your experience." And I said, "I can't explain to you what light is, so don't be surprised if I can't explain to you how God can be human and divine at the same time. But I said, I believe it. Why? Because it's the only thing that makes sense of the evidence." That's it. Don't be embarrassed if you can't answer impossible questions. The Word became flesh. How was it possible, ladies and gentlemen? Because human beings were made in God's image, that's how. And in the unforgettable words of my friend and mentor, David Gooding, who years ago made the comment, "You know, John," he said, "human beings are the only kind of creature God could become." It's majestic, isn't it? What a dignity it gives to every one of us tonight to realize not only are we created in the image of God, but the profound implication of that. That God himself could become human. Yes. Where do we go from here? Well, we shall go on a big journey this week. But as I close tonight, I want to remind you just of one more thing. At the beginning of Genesis, we're told that God called the light day and the darkness he called night. So the first day in Genesis is less than 24 hours, isn't it? That'll give some of you something to think about. These days all have different meanings, many of them 4 meanings in Genesis 1 for the word. But as I said, there will be a question time, I hope. I simply want to point out to you that Genesis 1 is not just about creating. It is about organizing our universe. And the fascinating thing, it's such a big lesson, most people have never seen it, is that the lighting system has been so arranged that it's outside our world. And the one who invented it once commented on it when he was on this earth, having become human. There was a man who had died, a man called Lazarus. And Jesus announced that he was going to him back in Judea, where it was dangerous and the public pressure was against him. And it would be risky to go, far better to stay. And Jesus said, aren't there 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. That is, we don't have a light built into us. Wouldn't you love to have one sometimes, as you stumble around in your caravan in the dark and trip over the cat and all the rest of it? Oh no, God has arranged the light outside our world. Why is that? And Jesus points out the lesson that is to be learned from it. What light illuminates your world tonight? As you look out into the future, what light is going to open up the path? Is it inside you? Is it because you've got a good brain and a good education? Or have you come to discover, as I have, that there's a light outside my tiny world? And when Jesus came, he said, I am the light of the world. If a man follow me, he shall not walk in the darkness, but shall have the light of life. The light moves. And of course, if the light is here and I am here, I'm in the light. But if the light moves and I stay where I am, I end up in the dark. And this week, we shall all be challenged to follow the moving light. That is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, wherever he leads. Oh, I'm thrilled, you know, that God hasn't left us in the dark. He who invented the human mind has not left us ignorant of what he has done or is planning to do. And the biggest thing, of course, is this, is it not? That the one who invented the atom, who created space-time, the pathways of the human brain, not only himself became human, but he loved me and he gave himself for me. Ladies and gentlemen, Jesus Christ competes with no one, you know. No one. Because no other philosophy or religion offers me what he does. The knowledge of the Creator, of peace with him, of satisfaction and fulfillment, of answers that go down to the roots of the deepest questions that we humans can ask. And a certainty that he can hold even me when the pressure of opposition rises. May God help us this week to get an insight into what it's all about and to be utterly transformed so that we become a force that will shape this country for the future and provide a credible witness to God for people who are starving without it.